Before we dive into today's episode, I have two invitations to share, one from myself and one from today's guest. First, I invite you to join us this Saturday, March 1st, for an online gathering that I'm hosting. It is titled Dancing with Darkness, a virtual descent into the vital mystery of light and shadow. This event offers a rich opportunity to explore the primordial dance of light and shadow, featuring visionary talks from Ganga Devi Braun and Daje Alo, as well as a live conversation between myself and Samuel Adams, all past guests of this project. Together, we will reflect, share stories, and engage in a deep interactive exploration of these wild forces. A recording is included with every ticket purchase, so you can revisit the insights at any time. And for the final days of sales, we're offering a 2-for-1 ticket deal, so you can share this content with a dear loved one who you think might benefit from it. So follow the link in the show notes to join us this Saturday for a virtual descent into the vital mystery of light and shadow. The second invitation comes from Joe Brewer and the Design School for Regenerating Earth. Their 2025 learning journey, How to Organize Your Bioregion, begins March 18th. This is truly a powerful and accessible opportunity to gain the knowledge needed to activate regenerative change in your life, in your community, and in your bioregion. You'll find more details in the show notes. Welcome to Wild Heart Revival, a gathering place for heartfelt conversations and stories as pathways of renewal and revival. I'm your host, Tay Tayari, and today's guest is Joe Brewer. Joe and I explore the true meaning of collapse, not as an apocalyptic end, but as a transformation of pattern and stability. We discuss the planetary tipping points already crossed, the unraveling of human systems, and the urgent need for regenerative pathways. Drawing from his book, The Design Pathway for Regenerating Earth, Joe shares how bioregional organizing, regenerative economies, and living system principles can guide us toward renewal. Together, we rediscover our ancestral roots, the role of water in regeneration, and the power of education to restore our connection with the living world. Joe Brewer is the founder of Earth Regenerators, co-founder of the Design School for Regenerating Earth, and a steward of bioregional Earth. A regenerative designer working at the intersection of complexity, cultural evolution, and Earth systems, he has spent the last 5 years catalyzing bioregional regeneration efforts in the northern Andes of Colombia. His work spans ecosystem restoration, regenerative education, alternative finance, and large-scale landscape collaboration. Personally, I cannot recommend Joe's book, the related resources, and the Design School enough. At the deepest level of my being, I feel in my bones and at the core of my spirit that this work of regeneration is the most important call of our time. I truly believe it's why we are here at this precious and precarious moment in human and earth history. There are groups organizing around this work all over the world and likely right in your own backyard. So I encourage you to explore what's happening in your bioregion and see how you can contribute your heart to ongoing regenerative projects guided by the impeccable principles that are laid out in the Design Pathway for Regenerating Earth. If you are new to the show, you might like to know that I am a threshold counselor with an online practice dedicated to supporting wanderers, wanderers, and edgewalkers. I offer individual, couples, and group counsel, as well as support around death and dying. To learn more, visit my website through the link in the show notes, and know that I offer free insight calls, which provide a risk-free opportunity for us to connect, explore our alignment, and determine if we're a good fit to walk alongside each other during a pivotal time in your life. I'm generally open to connecting via email and video chat if you feel naturally drawn to do so, whether for guidance, curiosity, collaboration, or any other meaningful reason. So feel free to reach out anytime. If you haven't yet, I invite you to subscribe to Wild Heart Revival on your preferred podcast platform, and know that your likes, comments, ratings, and shares are not only deeply appreciated, they are vital for supporting the organic growth of these heartfelt conversations and stories. Now, let's humble ourselves to the immense complexity, intelligence, and wisdom of earthly flows and forces, so that we can truly orient toward a regenerative pathway into the future as we welcome our dear guest for today, Joe Brewer. What is our ecological context right now, and are we truly in planetary collapse?
Just want to let that question sit for a moment for the listener, because this is something we need to feel before we can think. Otherwise, our thinking is a distraction, like a reaction to feeling it. So I want to just name very briefly what collapse means to me as a complexity scientist. That's part of my background, and what it means to have a phase transition in a complex system where it goes from one kind of behavior to another, where there's some kind of order or regularity and it breaks down. And then that creates this chaos, this instability and lack of pattern, and then new patterns emerge later. So collapse is a breakdown and a kind of renewal, but not a renewal in the sense it goes back to the way it was before, but the renewal of a different kind of stability and pattern. And so when we think of collapse in that way, collapse doesn't have to be so scary, although parts of it can be. And one of the things that has been confusing for people about collapse is that it's usually anthropocentric. Like, oh, the human civilization, if it's not collapsing, then we're not in collapse. But collapse has been happening for a long time. I will actually go back about 8,000 years and take the work of William Rudiman, who's a geologist and who studied what are called the Milankovitch cycles, which is this Earth and sun relationship that created the ice ages. And about 8,000 years ago, he found that we should have started, actually about 4,000 years ago, we should have started going back into another ice age, and we didn't. And instead, he watched a gradual accumulation of trace amounts of greenhouse gases that were from between 8,000 and 4,000 years ago. And the reason I go back there is the reason those changes in water vapor and greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane is because of the slow accumulation of deforestation. And the deforestation was happening with the invention of agriculture, the creation of city-states, and with early civilizations. So starting 11,000 years ago, the beginning of agriculture, it's called the Neolithic Revolution. But by 4,000 years later, 3,000 to 4,000 years later, there's a measurable change in greenhouse gas composition that kept us from going back into another ice age. So we had a collapse of the pattern of ice ages, which is called the Pleistocene, and there's like 2.5 million years of history. 2.5 million years of ice ages are over. They don't exist anymore. So when we talk about this collapse, it's actually been happening for a very long time. But in the last 100 years, just go and Google the rate of extinction for biodiversity loss, and you'll see starting about the year 1900, we have this growing number of extinctions. And in 1950, with the Green Revolution and the population explosion of humans, you see a rapid acceleration of extinction of non-human species, which corresponds with massive scale ecological destruction. So this is a collapse of biodiversity that is 100 years old and really accelerating as of 75 years ago. So when people say, well, collapse is in the future, that's because they're not looking at non-human signals like the rate of extinction. So where we are in planetary collapse. So that's like my context to say, you don't need to be scared of collapse. Everyone alive today was born into planetary collapse. It was already happening when you were born. But what's happening right now is we're going through a series of tipping points. And specifically, those tipping points are in two realms, the realm of the climate system and the realm of the human system. So in the climate system, it's things like the shutdown of the deep ocean formation, what's called the North Atlantic circulation or the thermohaline circulation, which is because Greenland's ice sheets are melting so fast that fresh water is dumping into the North Atlantic, and it's disrupting ocean mixing, which could have big effects on jet streams and weather systems, especially in Western Europe. At the same time, the permafrost in Siberia is rapidly melting, causing explosive release of methane. And so this permaculture, or this permafrost breakdown is occurring. The boreal forest, which is this band around the Arctic Circle of the largest forest in the world, is rapidly drying out. Invasive species are entering. Wildfires are happening, like massive fires in Canada last year is a huge example of this, that the collapse or the dieback of the boreal forest. So there are about 15 of these Earth systems tipping points, and we are already showing evidence of crossing 4 or 5 of them, and they're interrelated with each other. And one of the big ones that people are talking about now is the shutdown of the hydrological pump of the Amazon rainforest, the collapse of the Amazon, which is the world's second largest forest after the boreal forest. And so these are indicators of Earth system collapse in the climate system. But the other kind of collapse is in social systems with extreme wealth inequality, with the breakdown of our ability to do sense making, where we can't actually manage things because they're too complex, with this rhetoric and propaganda of democracy, which is actually the spreading of populist totalitarianism and fascism and the rise of totalitarian leaders. There's a technocratic surveillance state, artificial intelligence kind of a system taking hold that is being funded by the plutocrats, basically by the billionaire class. So for those who remember Occupy Wall Street and Arab Spring, these big movements, those who are older and remember the World Trade Organization protests in Seattle, Washington in 1999, these anti-globalization movements, they have largely failed, and that technocratic globalist elite is taking over the world. And so there's a breakdown of governance and a breakdown of finance and a breakdown of democracy and the breakdown of the nation state. And just look at the United States and all of the focus on the US president, but it's actually a global technocratic billionaire elite that is leveraging, they're basically consuming the nearly dead body of a nation state to extract more wealth and power, but it's actually a globalized transnational power. So the collapse of the nation state is occurring. So this planetary collapse is very evident in human social systems and in Earth systems related to the climate. And we are now accelerating through tipping points. So that's where we are in the world today.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for laying that all out. Yeah, it's intense. And so in the face of all that, you wrote a book that seemed like it's really the accumulation of your life's work up until that point. It was published in 2021, The Design Pathway for Regenerating Earth. And in that, kind of near the beginning, you state that you think there's really only one way to regenerate the Earth. And you lay out a few other possible pathways, but you state clearly that there's one way. And so do you still feel that way now, a few years into really living into the design pathway? And could you kind of briefly summarize what that is and maybe touch in on what the other possible pathways could be, especially the sociopath's dream, just to kind of contrast the difference there?
Yeah, I would say what I laid out was scenarios. Like there are different ways you can create a story with different assumptions based on what's happening in the world and project them into the future. And then from those scenarios, you can make decisions today. And one of the scenarios was the sociopathic nightmare, which is exactly what is happening right now in the dying system. And I want to actually name that both the design pathway I laid out and the sociopath's dream or the sociopathic nightmare, they're both happening and they're both intensifying. And that paradox is just reality. It's just truth. So if you look and watch Elon Musk bringing in a bunch of technocrats to come in and gut the US Census Bureau and gather information to surveil people, that's the sociopath's dream, right? That's part of the sociopath's dream. It is literally happening today. Today, we'll get more news of something that's happening as the United States consumes and destroys itself. And so the sociopath's dream is basically that the billionaire elites who use technology and the idea of transhumanism to basically create a cyborg of human machine integrated that is quote unquote better than humans, so that they can put themselves into a cryogenic freeze, basically upload their minds to silicon, leave their organic bodies behind, go and create colonies on Mars, mine asteroids. It's basically imperial conquest, rape and pillage, except into the galaxy. That's their dream. And their dream is to destroy the Earth to catapult themselves into a transhuman form in space, leaving the rest of humans behind if they exist at all. They haven't gone extinct. And so that's the sociopath's dream, and you can see them doing it right now. The alternative is, you might just call it the coming home, returning to mother.
Yeah.
Remembering that humans always have been part of the Earth. That's a biological fact. Just like all human races are biologically human, and we have common ancestors from Africa. And actually, if you go back far enough, all multicellular organisms have common ancestors with bacteria, because multicellular organisms are only about 750 million years old. Before that, it was only single-celled organisms. And that we all have common ancestors, and they come from the ocean floor. They come from the deep sea vents in the ocean floor in the continental shelves of the Earth in the early days of Earth history, going back about 3.8 billion years. And so the reality, the truth, is that humans are part of nature. Humans are part of the world. And so the design pathway is basically remembering two key things. One is that living systems have holistic patterns. And the holistic pattern for humans is what is called a bioregion, the biological geography of the entire living system for everything you need to live in a place. Where does your water come from? Where does your breathable air come from? Where do all of the materials for construction of housing and shelter, for your clothing, for medicine, for food? What are all of those relationships as a place-based story? Which is what indigenous people were and what they are today, for those who are still able to maintain that way of life. So it's the ancestral homeland way of thinking, except with one big difference, which is unlike our ancestors who lived at a bioregional scale in their own territories, like where you live in the Northwest, the Salish people, the co-Salish people of the Salish Sea in what is now British Columbia and Washington and Oregon, in those regions.
Wait, I'm in Guatemala now.
Guatemala, oh my gosh, you've moved. Well, never mind it. Then we could talk about the Mayan people and their ancestral homelands and the Milpa and their agroecology systems and all of that. And we'd have the same argument.
Yeah.
That these people have integrated a harmonious way of life into their territorial landscapes. And that is what humans were for all of human history until this period I described of the Holocene and agriculture and city-states and empires in the last 8,000 to 10,000 years. What we need to do now is return to that way of living with one key fundamental shift, which is we need to return to a bioregional way of being, except also to be planetary. To understand that we need to work within the planetary dynamics of the Earth system as a whole. And there's a very practical reason for that. We have degraded the Earth systems so much that they will restore themselves on their own timeframes that don't care about humans. But if humans choose to stay, we must collaborate to restore the ocean circulation. We must restore the El Nino and La Nina patterns, which give stable rainfall to North and South America. We must restore the snowpack of the Colorado Rockies. We must maintain and stabilize the snowpack of the 35,000 glaciers of the Himalayas. We must restore the stable patterns of ecological connectivity across 200 watersheds that make up the Amazon basin, and so on, everywhere on Earth. So we need to restore Earth systems patterns, Earth systems relationships through bioregional organizing. And so what this means is we need a planetary network of people collaborating and learning together about how to create education, how to create finance and governance and living practices of restoring the health of our ecosystems in our place, creating regenerative economies in our place, and collaborating with other places to do it at both this bioregional scale, this holistic living system scale of our place, and as a network across the planet. And so this is where the prophecies of the eagle and the condor, which is this prophecy that the 500 years of colonization in the Americas would come to an end through an exchange between North and South America. And if you're in Guatemala, then you could add the colibri, the hummingbird, the quetzal, which is the sacred bird of Mexico. And it's actually that the birds are what connect North, Central, and South America. The migration of birds between Canada and Peru, this massive migration every year, is the living exchange of North, Central, and South America, which is why the prophecy is about birds. It's about the quetzal, the hummingbird, the eagle, and the condor. And that coming together is cultural exchanges across the Americas. And so there's this way in which the prophecies and the indigenous knowledge play a fundamental role in all of this. But at its core, unlike the sociopath's dream, which denies humanity, says, get rid of the human part and make us machines, it's embrace our humanity as living biological beings, return to our great mother, return to Gaia, return to Pachamama, return to the fact that Earth has always been our home and is our home, and we need to care for our home as part of the Earth. And so that is what's amazing, is that this is the regenerative movement with millions of local projects. This is not a small thing, and it's not new. And the bioregional movement is not accidentally connected with the origin of the permaculture movement and the back to the land movement of the 60s and 70s in the last century. That's not an accident at all. This discovery of an ethic of care to work with living systems, which was inspired by Aboriginal people in Australia, which is where permaculture practice comes from originally. And its sort of general technical term now is agroecology, the cultural systems of relating for a living system of place, which I would say in some ways permaculture is a subset of, or is a modern Western language to name something similar. It's finding the same patterns of wisdom. And that is what living into the design pathway of regenerating Earth is.
Yeah. So for someone who's maybe just tuning into this kind of conversation, could you just describe what makes a system regenerative so that we can orient to what regenerating even means and how to live in that way?
Absolutely. I really like the way that Daniel Christian Wall makes the point that regeneration is a biological process, just like respiration and just like metabolism. So you're in like 7th grade or 8th grade, you'll start learning these basic biological concepts, or maybe you learn them in high school, but you learn that a living organism has metabolism. It needs to eat food, it needs respiration, the food is broken down in the body, the waste is released, and the nutrients are cycled into the body, and that metabolic process is part of biology. Well, regeneration is the more general understanding of that. Regeneration, I would say metabolism and respiration are subsets of regeneration. They're both regenerative patterns, but they are actually interwoven. Respiration creates an energy source. The burning of oxygen and the movement of oxygen with your red blood cells through your body helps create local energy stores for the metabolic process in your cells, so they're deeply connected. So basically, regeneration I like the way that Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela describe it from the Chilean School of Cognitive Science. So it's two Chilean philosophers and scientists. And back in the 1970s, they created this term autopoiesis, which is a Greek word. Autopoiesis means the self-created ability to express oneself. Poesia, poetry, the ability to express oneself. Auto poetry, the ability to express yourself, but also the ability to create the ability to express yourself. So now let's take a paramecium swimming around in a little pool of water, and it's got little cilia, little like, flagella, these little like floating arms, and it can swim. And what does it do? It swims toward food and it swims away from predators, which means it can guide itself toward what it needs to keep producing its patterns of being alive. It can go and gather food to feed its metabolism. And so regeneration is the ability to reproduce the conditions of being alive moment to moment. Mm-hmm. Now I'll give a large scale of example of this, because something you'll quickly notice about biology is that life only exists where water exists. Mm-hmm. There's always water. Mm-hmm. And so let's take the hydrological cycle. You have evaporation from an ocean. It rises up in the air and condenses and makes clouds. The clouds drop water as rain. The rain falls into a tree canopy, into soil. It runs downhill with gravity. And what does it do? It moves into the body of every living being. Yeah. Because your body and my body are about 70% water. Water is literally expressing itself in our conversation right now. And so when we look at how the hydrological cycle works, what we see is the living systems, the living organisms, the ecosystems, the biological beings are cycling water to keep ourselves alive. Mm-hmm. But we're also reproducing the conditions that attract water, because the tree canopy in a vegetated landscape will engage in evapotranspiration, which is that it'll sweat through its pores, and as it sweats through the pores on its leaves, it will release water, which will cool the air, and which will lower the air pressure, which will attract clouds, which will encourage more rain to occur. And so the hydrological cycle is being augmented by the ecosystems of the place. Mm-hmm. Which is why a desert is not the absence of water. A desert is the absence of vegetation that attracts clouds. Mm-hmm. And brings the rain. And so when we understand that a hydrological cycle is a pattern of regeneration, the living organisms change the dynamic to make it easier for the water to come, to continually cycle water to keep the organisms alive. Mm-hmm. Then we know if we want a living landscape, we need to plant the plants, build the soils, create the biodiversity that changes the air pressure and attracts the water. Mm-hmm. We don't just plant something and pray for rain. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We understand there's an actual pattern there we can work with. Mm-hmm. And that pattern is regeneration. So that's why regeneration becomes the way of stewarding and partnering with the living systems of a place. Mm-hmm. I partner with the forest to create forest health, and the forest gives me everything that I need. And this is why Indigenous people say that their brothers and sisters are the oak tree, they are the bear, they are the salmon, they are the hummingbird, because they are. Literally, my life is entangled in the relationships of regeneration with those ecosystems. Mm-hmm. And if I destroy them, I destroy the basis of my own survival. Mm-hmm. Which is what the Haudenosaunee people call natural law. Which is that nature works this way, and you either work with it or you die. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty basic. So that's why regeneration is the core understanding for this movement. We have to understand what regeneration is. We have to learn to see it in the world, and then we need to create the conditions for it.
Yeah. Yeah, and so obviously the techno-industrial, militarized economic machine that is dominant across the globalized culture of this time is in opposition to what you just described, right? I hope everyone can see that quite clearly. It just takes a moment to reflect and look out and feel, to recognize that. So that seems to be, if not the biggest, certainly one of the biggest barriers to living into a regenerative way of life and a pathway of regeneration. So could we talk about regenerative economics? And, you know, in your book, you outline those 8 principles. I'm not sure if you remember them now, but just whatever feels important to you now, to just kind of give people a frame of reference of, like, if you feel that the economy is this huge barrier and how could you ever go a different direction, just to lay a foundation of, like, well, this is what regenerative economics might look like and feel like.
Yeah, I'll start by saying that my book is mostly a collection of other people's ideas. I just put them together into a story. So the framework you're naming right now is the 8 Principles of Regenerative Economy by John Fullerton at the Capital Institute, which is a really nice model to learn from. Because what John Fullerton did is he went and gathered information from a lot of other people and created a beautiful synthesis of it. And so, so you can go to the Capital Institute's website and learn more about it. And what I would say that's really powerful about what he did and that way of thinking is that you start to see that an economy is real in 2 fundamental ways. Because we have lots of fake or illusory ways of talking about economies that aren't real. Like our economy of money may not be real. It may not be based on anything real. So let's start with something real. One thing that's real is what I just said. Water moves through living organisms. It moves through every one of our bodies. And if there's no water, we dry out and fall apart. We die. And so a real economy involved the movement of water. A real economy is connected to water. And then how do you grow an economy? An economy grows by bringing more inorganic matter, meaning matter that's part of the world, that's not part of a living system, and you make it organic matter. And how do you do that? There's a word, it's called biomass. Biomass is the measure of how much matter is held in the living beings of a place. Like how much biomass of mushrooms, how much biomass of soil, how much biomass of plant, like the tree trunks and the leaves of plants, how much biomass of mammals. And so if we went from measuring the size of the economy by the amount of money we spend on goods and services, which is called gross domestic product, GDP. GDP is the measurement of money that moves by buying and selling products and services. What if instead of that, we looked at what ecologists call trophic flow? Trophic flow is the food web. The food web, you know, energy and nutrients moving through the bodies of organisms as they eat each other. The mushrooms decomposing the fallen tree, you know, the tiger that eats the gazelle, you know, and they take the nutrients from one form to another. And you look at this flow of energy and nutrients, and you say the size of the economy depends on the number of organisms for each species together with the diversity of species. So if you want to grow an economy, you grow the biodiversity or you grow the ecological complexity. Then when you start to see that that's what a real economy is, then how do you do that? You know, what does it mean? First of all, real economies always exist somewhere. They're connected to place. Like that tree has roots in a place. That wolf pack has a nomadic pattern across a place. And it could be a geographic range, but it's still a place. Salmon can swim out into the ocean and swim up a river, but they still have a geography of their place, which is why the idea of a bioregion is so important for creating a regenerative economy. We need to understand what is the geographic area, the geographic pattern for a healthy economy. And notice this isn't the same as isolationism. It's not the same as those economic ideas of we're going to hoard things here and keep them from those people there. It's the recognition that a real economy is about relationships and it's about context. And it's about relationships between living beings. And it's not only about humans. It's ecological. It involves all of ecology. And so then we start to see things like, oh, a real regenerative economy honors and cares about community and place. Because place matters. Place is why life can exist. And community is the relationships for that place. So honoring community and place is part of a regenerative economy. And a regenerative economy seeks balance. It's dynamic, it's never static. You never have, so one of the fundamental assumptions of modern macroeconomics is equilibrium, that the price reaches an equilibrium. It's called Pareto's optimum. It's from about 100 years ago, 120 years ago in economics. The only reason they could get mathematics to work for neoclassical economics was to assume steady state. To assume that the economy was dead.
Yeah.
It had reached equilibrium. If your heart reaches equilibrium, it means you died.
Yeah.
And so the economics of dead matter doesn't help us. We need an economics of living systems. And so a lot of those ways of thinking about supply and demand curves and all that ridiculousness, the only way to get a number is to assume equilibrium. Just ask an economist, they'll tell you. These are the assumptions for the calculus that they use for the mathematics. Whereas if you ask an ecologist to assume equilibrium, they'll look at you like you're insane. Like, that makes no sense. Living systems are dynamic. They're never at equilibrium. That's why complexity science and evolutionary science are the basis of regenerative economics. And then you start to see things like, oh, a regenerative economy is about the flow of energy in our relationships, the flow and the movement and the transformation of things that are of value. So local supply chains become really important. Local knowledge becomes really important. Local ecology and local culture become the centerpiece of an economy, which tells you have to think really differently about education, really differently about art and music, really differently about craft skills. And so there are a lot of implications. But what's beautiful is all of those implications bring us into a healthier and happier way of being, a more human way of being. A regenerative economy is local and translocal. Translocal just means it's relationships across a network in multiple places. So we can have exchange, but the basis of exchange is through treaties, through agreements, with sovereignty by the local people. Doesn't this sound like indigenous relationships? Because it should. So regenerative economies become more and more like the wisdom traditions of indigenous people. They move in that direction. So it restores spirituality. It restores a sense of the sacred. If you don't have a sense of the sacred, if you don't feel like your water is sacred, then how are you going to care for it when there are difficult times? And so there are a lot of elements to this that make economics about a lot more than the movement of goods and services, which is what it's been narrowed to in the kind of mechanistic worldview of the modern era.
Yeah. It's a fundamental shift in consciousness, in perception, and capacity for collaboration and co-creation with the living intelligences of place. And so then you mentioned it for a moment there. It's that there's it involves a shift in education. And when I think about the way that I was educated, and probably not too different from yourself, it was very much in this worldview, this mechanized worldview. Basically had the feeling of being trained of how to work in a factory or work as a machine, a cyborg, like you mentioned earlier. And so let's talk about that shift in education. Like, what does regenerative education look and feel like?
One of the most exciting things in my life in the last 2 years has been that it actually started in a kind of grief and pain, but I had a dream for restoring dead rivers with children where we live in Barichara, Colombia. And that dream was connected to a different way of educating children. And there was a crisis. I won't tell the story of that crisis now. I'll just say that in the darkest hours of my crisis, the beam of light for me was that I could see how to help the children by focusing on my own daughter, who just turned 8 years old. So 2 years ago, she was 6 years old. But I would look at my daughter And I would ask, what does my daughter need in her education? And how can we give that to everyone in our community? How can we do it together? And so we gave birth to a regenerative school for children called Sueños del Bosque, which is Spanish for Dreams of the Forest.
Yeah.
And this school is inspired by Waldorf. So if you're familiar with the Waldorf principles of humans are natural living organisms, and each of us is unique, and we each have our own, as Bill Plotkin would say, for those who are familiar with him, we each have our own soul work, which is our calling from our own heart, our unique gifts to give in the world in the time that we live. And that Waldorf is really good at cultivating the protection of this passion and this drive within each child. Each child has something in them to express. And so it's individualized education around the natural development of their social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. And so regenerative education is strongly connected to those three things: social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. And then the fourth element is embedded within the relationship with nature in the place where they are. And so part of the way I see regenerative education working is decolonizing our minds, unlearning things that we were taught that aren't correct or aren't true and that don't serve us, and unlearning them, which is a kind of trauma healing process.
Yeah.
And then also reconnecting. So for those who are familiar with the work of Joanna Macy, the work that reconnects, the work that reconnects is regenerative education. Regenerative education is the work that connects.
Yeah.
It's like, how do I connect with my pain? How do I connect with my ancestral lineage? How do I connect with the destruction that my ancestors or my economy are causing in the world? How do I connect with this little river or this little garden or this part of the way that food is grown in my community? How do I reconnect? And so I see regenerative education being about coming back into relationship with that which gives us life. So regenerative education is building soil. It is reforestation. It is local food systems. It is local textiles. It is arts and crafts. It is creative expression. It is love and beauty. And it's also pain and sorrow. It's remembering to be fully human. It's intergenerational, which is really essential. One of the great discoveries about human cultural evolution is that there are very few animals that are what is called eusocial. Eusocial is a biology term for organisms that create really complex social organization. So ants have really complex social organization, and they do it by having the same generation having differentiated roles. So like there are fighter ants, there are builder ants, there are egg-laying ants, and so ants have this differentiation of roles. That's eusocial organisms. The only eusocial organisms that have complex culture and cultural evolution are mammals, and they're mammals because mammals have empathy, because mammals give birth to live young, and the parents must care for their young when they're vulnerable. And there are only a couple of species of mammals where the females live beyond reproduction, which means they go through menopause. Right? Yeah. Where the females,
grandmas.
They're grandmas. And you look, the grandma species, prairie dogs. Prairie dogs have a version of this. Elephants, whales, and humans.
Okay.
And there are things like, look at gorillas and chimpanzees, and you see some very complex social dynamics. But there's this phenomenon called the grandmother effect, which is to educate young and bring them into the knowledge of their culture over an extended developmental period. You need grandmothers.
Yeah.
Like the elephants that know how to walk across a long desert path to find the water to keep them alive. And for humans, the grandmothers aid and support the raising of children. And they tell stories, and they remember the big storm, and they remember when the men were fighting, and they remember the things that the culture needs in times of crisis. And there's a lot more to that story, but I just want to say regenerative education is fundamentally intergenerational.
Yeah.
restoring this. This is another way of thinking about 7 generations.
Mm-hmm.
You can think of 7 generations as I'm alive today and I have 3 generations before me, my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, and 3 generations after me, my children, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren. There are other ways of thinking of it. If you just look at it in that way, 7 generations is maintaining continuity across the 3 generations in front and the 3 generations behind that it is possible to directly relate to in your life.
Mm-hmm.
You could grow old enough to know your grandchildren and great-grandchildren.
Mm-hmm.
You could have elders who live long enough to know your great-grandparents. My daughter knew her great-grandmother for 2 years, 3 years, but she knew her. She calls her Grandma Busha because Busha is the Polish name for grandma.
Mm-hmm.
And so the 7 generations understood that way shows us that regenerative education is the 7 generations framework.
Mm-hmm.
Lived. So we have to restore community connection, and we have to restore a connection to place through education, which is another way of saying that regenerative education is bioregional in the way I described it earlier. We're just talking about it with different language, but we're talking about the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Many threads there, trying to see which one to pull on. I was reminded of, I'm sure you've come across Tyson Yunkaporta's work. Yeah. And I was listening to an interview with him recently, and the interviewer asked something like, if you had one thing to tell people, what would you say? Something like that. And he said, follow the ants. Follow the ants. And he didn't really get into it so much. He just said that, like really, really pay attention to what the ants are doing, and you'll learn probably more than you need to. And so, I don't have a lived experience of that so much, but it makes me want to ask you, what comes up for you when I bring that up? Is there a species, and it seems weird to narrow it down to one, right? But is there a pattern that you think has been really impactful for you, and that you would invite others to really pay close attention to?
Absolutely, there is one, and it is water.
Yeah.
So something that I started doing about 5 years ago when we moved to Barichara, Colombia, I started doing work in a beautiful project here called Bioparque Moncora. Moncora is the name of a native tree. And the Bioparque, the biopark, is a community forest that's growing. And 2 beautiful older women, Camila and Vicky, started this in 2009. And what I began to do was practice very basic permaculture, which was I would go when it rained. Even if it was the middle of the night, I'd take like a waterproof flashlight and a pickaxe. And when it started to rain, I would dig contour swales. I would dig trenches that were perpendicular to the downhill direction.
Yeah.
So they would be on the same level. And so that the water would flow into them. And, the saying in watershed restoration is slow it, spread it, sink it. You slow the water down, you spread it out, it sinks into the ground. And so I started doing that. And I found I did not need to measure the contour lines. Later I played with creating an A-frame and measuring it, being like an engineer, and it's fun. And there is a time, when you do that, you don't need the water to be there to dig the ditch in the right way. So those techniques are really useful. But what I found more powerful, because it was a spiritual practice, was when the rain came, I would jump. It's like middle of the night. It would start raining. I'd jump out of bed and throw on my clothes and run out into the rain, get covered in mud. And I would just watch the water and dig. And I would dig for the water to go where I could tell the water wanted to go. And the water moves and churns and turns. And as it slows and settles, the sediments settle out and they layer themselves. And there's this richness and complexity. And the seeds that have been blowing in the wind move with the sediments that are carried in the water. And they settle and deposit where these sediments of sand and silt are. And then they grow in the sun. And they make shade for other plants. And like there's this whole beautiful process of a piece of like concrete like super hard compacted clay becoming soil.
Mm.
By the way, the sediments are carried by the water,
Mm.
settling out, carrying a seed that blew in the wind, becoming a little bunch of grass, and in that grass creating enough shade for eventually a boring ant, or a beetle that bores a hole, or an ant that comes and digs a hole and creates porousness in the soil, and then the mycorrhizal networks that can't come until there's roots. So they're not there in the beginning. And then eventually like bushes are there, and then the leaves fall and they start to make this detritus layer, and you're starting to build soil. And it's all by watching the movement of water.
Yeah.
And there's another part of this that really was powerful for me, something that I had to transform in myself, which is my dad was a chain smoker. He smoked cigarettes. And I hated cigarettes. I was like, cigarettes are disgusting. Because he'd drive in the car on these winding roads in the Ozarks. I grew up in Missouri in these winding hills. And on those curves, I would get motion sickness as a kid. So you'd have to stop for me to jump out and vomit into the ditch. And I'd throw up because of the movement of the car and because my dad was smoking cigarettes and the car was filled with smoke. So I hated cigarettes. I hated tobacco. I had no idea that tobacco is a sacred plant. And right? And just like how cocaine is the bastardization of coca, and coca is this amazing sacred plant in the northern Andes, tobacco, which is what is used in the peace pipes of North America, tobacco is the peace plant because tobacco is about helping men to seek guidance from their male ancestors. So tobacco connects you to your father, to your grandfather, to your great-grandfather. And tobacco is a plant of peace. It helps your male ancestors to guide you in your male role, the role of men in building peace. And so I say this because I started to smoke tobacco on the full moon. Now, the full moon is the heightened power of the sacred feminine, the invisible tidal forces that churn the world's ocean and that cause hydrological pressure to change in plants. So as you probably learned in the tropics, you prune during a particular cycle of the moon. It's luna minguante, this time when the moon is causing the water to lower in the plant, so you're losing less of the water because it's stored in the roots. And so this tidal forces are actually in our bodies. Women know this. We men are less sensitive to it. What tobacco does is tobacco makes men more sensitive to the feminine energy, to those hidden energies. So I started to smoke tobacco on the day of the full moon to do watershed restoration work. I would go to a place where I was going to dig a retention pond, where I was going to do a terrace planting, but I was going to shape the way the water moves into the land. And what is my job in that sort of sacred masculine? Is to penetrate the soil, to create the context in which the seeds can be planted. This is a male energy dynamic, but I needed the receptivity of the container. I needed the sacred feminine. And so my job in permaculture practice was to create the female containers in the shape of the land. So what I would do is I would smoke tobacco on the day of the full moon to feel the sacred feminine and to ask for the guidance of my male ancestors to see where the water should go. Where should I bring life? Now you can feel the power of that meditation for every decision, not just where I dig a hole, right?
Yeah.
And so I have found that water has guided me, like the movement, the hydrological pressure, the movement of water up and down in the plant bodies with the movement of the moon. How many people even know that there are tidal dynamics in the bodies of plants? Or in the bodies of women, because we've forgotten all of this. So it's not just watching the water move during the rain, although that's a pretty awesome way to learn about water. So I would just say, learn from water. She shows us water is the eternal life-giving element. I just was at a gathering of Indigenous people in Ontario a few weeks ago. We were talking about the two-eyed way of seeing for knowledge commons and bioregional mapping in Southern Ontario and the greater Takaranto bioregion. And there was a woman there who said that water is the sacred element of the feminine. And all women are guardians of the sacred role of water. Why? Because water brings life. So all women are the guardians of life. All women are the water guardians. That's why women are the water walkers. That's why there are sacred artifacts that only women can carry in ritual, and that men smoke tobacco and women don't smoke tobacco in most indigenous cultures, because tobacco is to help men find the guidance of their male ancestors who came into healthy relationships with women, which is they came into healthy relationships with water and with life and with peace building. So I just wanted to name that there's this deep way. Notice I'm like a farm boy from Missouri. I might sound pretty indigenous right now. And that's because all of us can become the ancestors of future indigenous people.
Yeah.
And we do it by learning how to connect with life, which is learning how to connect with water.
Yeah.
So our pathway back into indigeneity may not be talking with an indigenous person. An indigenous wisdom holder would tell you to talk to the water, to talk to the mountain. That's what they did. That's what their ancestors taught them. They had cultural guidance in that, and people like me, we didn't. But we can still find a lot of it that way. So just wanted to name that water is extremely powerful for teaching us more than we realize. I'll just say that.
Agreed. And it's incredibly painful to consider how disconnected most folks are from water, particularly from wild water. You know, if you're living in a city, you're not contacting wild water. If you're living in most places, even near a city, you're probably not. Probably most of the waterways are unhealthy, damaged, poisoned, things like that. And so it's incredible to think about how few people ever contact or drink of wild water in their life. So you really have to seek it out. It has to be a deep meditation to connect with the spirit of water in the cultural context that we have now. I was reminded when you were talking there, Bio Komalafe, he says, the times are urgent, let us slow down. And I was also reminded of when I did a permaculture training some years ago. One of my teachers said, when you move onto a property and you have the intention of beginning a permaculture project, he said, you shouldn't do anything for at least a year. Don't touch anything. Just slow down and listen. Pay attention. Open your perception. Follow the water flows. Go through all the seasons of a solar year. Don't put your shovel into the soil before that, because you don't know what the plant nations, what the water, and all these living intelligences, how they are self-organizing on this landscape and how they want to regenerate or evolve and expand their life force. And I think that when it comes down to it, being a steward of a regenerative pathway is having the commitment, the persistence, the patience, the devotion to slowing down and listening, to enter into ceremony, to know that it's not all about the masculine, penetrative, get her done kind of orientation, that there's this deep feminine flow that we need to respect, to hold in reverence, to honor. And that means we need to really, really sensitize our systems for being able to receive. Yeah.
Yeah. It's really powerful to come into relationship with life again and to realize that we can.
Yeah.
Many of us don't even know we can.
Yeah.
And this relates to something I want to share before I know we'll need to come to close soon.
Yeah.
Something that is emerging right now in the Design School for Regenerating Earth, which is what was born from Earth Regenerators, which came before it, And Earth Regenerators was born as a study group for my book before it was published, and just grew into much more than a study group and took on a life of its own.
In a short amount of time, really. It's
Talking about
incredible.
regeneration. And one of the things we're doing is, starting on March 18th, we have a learning journey called How to Organize Your Bioregion. And people from all over the world are joining. And the idea is that you'll learn how to organize in your own place, and then also learn with others who are doing it in other places. And we're going to encourage the participants to practice organizing in their own communities. So the idea is to have an online or a digital space that creates coordination for our learning in our places, but the real emphasis is in our places.
Mm.
And the reason I want to share it is not to promote, what I'm doing, like I'm trying to promote it, but that a lot of people don't know what is meaningful to do right now. And there's a lot that's scary and paralyzing.
Yeah.
And what we need to do is reconnect with ourselves, reconnect with our local communities, reconnect with life, living systems, and organize. But how we organize matters.
Yeah.
And as we've talked about throughout this whole conversation, how we organize is, like you just said with that example of waiting a year and listening as a permaculture practice, how you organize is how the land tells you to organize.
Mm-hmm.
You're like, oh, that is how those plants like it that way. Let me just help them.
Mm-hmm.
This humility and this, it's a very different from a command and control mindset.
Mm-hmm.
It's much more of a care and support mindset.
Mm-hmm.
And that how we organize is how life organizes in our place. We learn to be part of life. And so I just wanted to invite that, because as the other larger globalized systems seem like they're more impossible to stop and devastating and destructive, we can just walk away from that, come back into our own backyards and our own watersheds and participate.
Yeah.
And if we do that, we will plant the seeds of regenerative culture for the future that humanity needs. And not just humanity, the biosphere, all the living beings of the planet. But if we don't do that, we probably won't be part of the planet for much longer. There's the Anishinaabe prophecy of the seventh and eighth fires, where the seventh fire is the realization that life is in trouble, that something is wrong in paradise.
Mm-hmm.
And the eighth fire is when humanity goes back and recovers our stories of what happened, so that we can make the empowered choice. And we either choose the path of ruin and death, or we choose the green path and service to life, as my friend Dan Longboat of the Mohawk Nation says. And so as we choose that path, we have to go back and recover our past.
Yeah.
Know how to choose that path. And so reconnecting with our life place and reconnecting with our ancestral history, including the genocidal history, the colonial history. We have to reconnect with that history to know how to move forward.
And it's not just history, right?
It's still very much alive today.
Yeah. We have to be with what is, turn toward it, take it in, compost it. Yeah. Yeah.
And also heal. We have to grieve and heal. Yeah. And so just to name that, that's something that's happening. And I invite it because we need companionship on this journey. Mm-hmm. We need to find the others. That was a big theme during the days of Earth Regenerators. It actually was a phrase that floated around a lot: finding the others, finding the others. Yeah. And many of us have been finding each other, but many more are still lost. They need to find the others. Mm-hmm. And so hopefully we can help them to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And at the end of your book, you say, at the heart of Earth regeneration is a new story about what it means to be human. And so I invite everyone to read this book that you wrote, because it's really a solid foundation to begin feeling into what that new story is about. And yeah, the invitation to join you on your learning journey and to start having these conversations, to not shy away from the complexity of it, all the emotions and feelings that come up with it. Turn to those that you trust enough and start humbling yourself to the not knowing and the inquiry of what it means to strike out on this path of regeneration. Yeah. So Joe, thank you so much for being here. It was so great to connect in with you and dive deep into this work. And yeah, just really grateful for what you're doing, man. Truly, I see it as being the most important work of our times. And I recommend all the time people to get your book, to check out the design school you have. And so whether you've known it or not, I've been in the background really channeling people to that pathway. And so, yeah.
Well, thank you, Tay, and thank you for just the conscientious way that you hold the way that you care in the world. It's so important. So that's something I definitely see.